Good morning, my dears. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 77 years old. And today I am going to share a story I carried in my heart for nearly half a century. Before I begin, if you are watching this, please do not forget to press the like button, subscribe to Grandma's Diary, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. That little gesture means the world to me, because it keeps me going, sharing memories that might just light a candle in someone else's darkness. It was the year 1972. I was only 30 years old then, living in Houston, Texas. America was going through a restless time, the aftershocks of the civil rights movement, the war overseas still leaving scars, but in our corner of the world, life seemed steady, almost idyllic. My husband, Daniel Carter, was admired by everyone. He was a partner at a respected law firm, always dressed in pressed suits, his tie perfectly knotted, his smile polished and dependable. People in church called him a man of honor. At neighborhood gatherings, they spoke his name with admiration. To the outside eye, I was the lucky woman who had won the heart of a successful man. We had 2 children who were the light of my life. James, our 9-year-old, was quiet and thoughtful, often lost in books about stars and planets. Clara, just 7, could spend hours at the table with crayons, filling page after page with her wild, beautiful drawings. Our home sat on a quiet, tree-lined street, a single-story brick house with a small garden out front where I planted roses that bloomed every spring. I was what they called a good wife in those days. I rose before dawn, made breakfast, packed school lunches, and ironed Daniel's shirts until they looked crisp as paper. In the afternoons, after the children left for school and the house settled into its gentle silence, I sewed gowns for ladies at church. It was not much, but it gave me a small sense of independence. My mother had once told me, a woman should always have a craft in her hands, something that belongs to her alone. I carried those words like a talisman, not realizing how much they would matter in the years ahead. If anyone had looked through the windows of that house in 1972, they would have seen a family that seemed complete. A well-dressed husband, 2 smiling children, a wife who served supper on time every evening. But behind those tidy curtains, shadows were gathering. Silences stretched too long. Daniel's eyes wandered. And though I tried to push the thought away, there were nights when I lay awake wondering, what part of my life was I missing? And what secret was it that my husband carried so carefully in the pockets of his immaculate suits? It was a Sunday. I will never forget August 20th, 1972. I remember it as clearly as if it were yesterday. The children were spending the afternoon at Daniel's mother's house. She adored spoiling them with pies and long stories by the porch swing. Daniel had left early, saying he needed to finish reviewing contracts for an oil settlement case at the firm. I was alone at home, battling a migraine that felt like nails pressing behind my eyes. I tried to rest, but the pain was unbearable. Daniel often kept stronger painkillers in his study medication he brought back from his trips to Dallas. His study was forbidden territory for me. He used to say, "A man needs a room where his thoughts are his own." But that day, the pain spoke louder than obedience. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. The room smelled of tobacco and the faint cologne he wore only on business trips. His desk was polished, his law books neatly lined up, his files stacked with almost obsessive order. I went straight to the drawers, knowing he often hid the pills there. My hands were trembling as I searched. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness hit me. To steady myself, I leaned against the bookshelf, and in doing so, I knocked loose a row of volumes. One heavy leather-bound Bible toppled to the floor, landing with a sound that echoed in the silence. I bent down to lift it, and as I did, something slipped from between its pages, a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. My first thought was to put it back untouched. Daniel would be furious if he knew I had seen anything in his sacred study. But something inside me whispered, "Look." With shaking fingers, I unfolded the note. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to Charles Holloway, Daniel's longtime law partner and closest friend. I had seen those loops and sharp strokes many times on Christmas cards and legal letters. The message was short. 7 words. If she finds out the truth, end her life. My knees weakened. I collapsed into Daniel's leather chair, clutching the paper as if it burned my skin. The migraine vanished in an instant, replaced by a chilling numbness spreading through my veins. Who was she? Was it me? What truth was so unbearable that it required my death? 1,000 thoughts collided in my head. Affairs. Money. Betrayal. Murder. I sat frozen for what felt like hours, staring at those words until they blurred. Finally, with deliberate care, I folded the note exactly as it had been, slid it back between the Bible's pages, and placed the book neatly on the shelf. Nothing would appear disturbed. I found the pills, swallowed one with water from the kitchen, and lay down on the living room sofa. When Daniel returned later that evening with the children, I smiled, served dinner, and listened to his stories as though nothing had happened. But inside me, something had broken forever. That night, while Daniel slept beside me, I stared into the darkness, clutching the sheets to still my trembling hands. I had crossed a threshold. I could no longer trust the man I had shared my life with for 10 years. And I knew, with a certainty that shook me to my core, that whatever truth hid behind those words, I had to uncover it quietly, carefully, and without ever letting him suspect. The days that followed became an exercise in acting. On the outside, I remained the perfect wife, breakfast ready before dawn, children neatly dressed, supper served at 6 o'clock sharp. But inside, I was a detective in my own home. I watched every glance Daniel cast, every hesitation in his speech, every phone call he took behind a closed door. The note had awakened a part of me I did not know existed, sharp, alert, unwilling to be deceived again. The first crack in the mask came one Wednesday evening as I prepared Daniel's suit for dry cleaning. While checking the inside pockets, my fingers brushed against something crumpled. I pulled out a folded receipt. At first, I thought nothing of it until I read the print. It was from a high-end jewelry store in Dallas. The purchase: a diamond necklace worth more than 3 months of our household expenses combined. My breath caught in my throat. Daniel had never once bought me jewelry beyond our plain gold wedding bands. For anniversaries, I received flowers, sometimes a modest scarf. Who, then, was the necklace for? In the same pocket, I found a small ivory-colored card. Written in his handwriting was an address in Dallas. No names, just numbers on a street I didn't recognize. I tucked everything back with careful precision, but my heart raced like a trapped bird. The following week, I made an excuse to travel to Dallas. I told Daniel I needed rare fabric for a client's gown. He barely glanced up from his papers before nodding. That in itself was suspicious. Normally, he questioned every dollar I spent. I found the address. It was a neat little house in an affluent neighborhood. I stood across the street, pretending to admire the trees, when a woman watering her garden next door caught my eye. She smiled kindly and said, "You must be looking for Lorraine." Such a sweet young teacher. Poor thing, she's expecting soon. Her fiancé visits every Thursday. Thursday, the very day Daniel always traveled on business. Her fiancé. My husband. I thanked the woman, forcing my face to remain calm, and walked away on legs that barely carried me. Every step was heavier with the truth. Daniel was not only betraying me, he was building another life. Back in Houston, the shadows around him seemed darker. He guarded his study more fiercely, locking drawers I had once seen open. He spent long hours at the office with Charles, returning home with tired excuses. One evening, after the children were asleep, I quietly searched again. Beneath a stack of legal folders in his study drawer, I found documents that chilled me. Property deeds, rewritten in another name, Lorraine's name. Insurance policies adjusted with unfamiliar beneficiaries. These were not the acts of a careless man. They were the careful preparations of someone planning to erase me and replace me. I closed the drawer, my hands trembling but my resolve solidifying. The note in the Bible was no longer just a threat, it was a blueprint. Daniel and Charles were orchestrating something far more sinister than infidelity. And if I didn't act, I feared I would one day vanish. Nothing more than a whispered rumor in a Houston neighborhood. From that night forward, every breath I took carried a new purpose: survival. If Daniel and Charles were planning to vanish with stolen money and leave me behind, perhaps even eliminate me, then I needed a plan of my own. I would not wait to be erased. The first step was securing money of my own. For years, I had earned a little from sewing gowns for church ladies. Until then, I kept the cash in a small tin box under my bed, afraid to draw Daniel's attention. Now, I realized it was not nearly enough. I needed something safer. One of my wealthiest clients, Mrs. Partible, Harrington, had always been fond of me. While fitting her daughter's dress, I confessed softly, "Daniel handles all the bank accounts. I only wish I had something put aside, just for emergencies." She lowered her voice and said, "Every woman should. Meet me in Dallas tomorrow. I'll introduce you to a banker who owes me favors." That was how I opened my first bank account under my own name quietly, in another city, beyond Daniel's reach. I deposited every dollar I had hidden over the years. It looked small against the vast sums my husband handled daily, but to me it was a lifeline. The second step was gathering proof. Words alone would mean nothing. Daniel was clever. He could twist any story until I looked like a jealous, bitter wife inventing lies. So, while the children were at school, I began slipping into his study with a small Polaroid camera I bought in Dallas. Each time Daniel left early for work, I photographed documents, offshore accounts, draft contracts, false identities. I slipped the photos between layers of fabric in my sewing basket, where no one but me would ever look. The deeper I dug, the more terrifying the picture became. Daniel and Charles were preparing to siphon off over $1 million from a settlement meant for an oil workers' union. They had already drafted wire instructions to shift the funds to accounts in Mexico. And there, hidden beneath the legal jargon, I found copies of passports bearing their photos, but different names. Daniel had become Robert Mason. Charles was now Henry Brooks. That night, as Daniel snored beside me, I sat upright, staring into the dark. My mind repeated a single thought: if I did nothing, my children and I would be left penniless, or worse. The third step was finding someone I could trust outside Houston. I remembered a federal investigator named Raymond Ellis, who once visited our church to warn about fraud schemes. Daniel had mocked him afterward, calling him too righteous for his own good. That insult became my salvation. If Daniel disliked him, perhaps it was because Ellis could not be bought. I began drafting a letter, careful and precise, outlining what I had discovered. I gathered the photographs, copies of receipts, and forged deeds. But how could I deliver them without Daniel's watchful eyes catching me? I would need help. And I would need courage. For the first time since I found that note, I felt something stronger than fear rising inside me: determination. If Daniel believed I was powerless, he had underestimated the woman he thought was nothing more than a wife in his shadow. The letter sat in my sewing basket for 3 days before I dared to move it. Each night, after tucking James and Clara into bed, I reread my words. They were simple but heavy, like stones, dates, names, figures. and copies of documents that tied Daniel and Charles to the embezzlement scheme. I ended it with a plea. Please act before it is too late. Lives may depend on it. But how could I get it to Raymond Ellis without Daniel noticing? Houston was a small city in some ways. And Daniel's network was everywhere. Lawyers, judges, even the sheriff. If I walked into the federal building myself, word would reach him by sundown. The answer came through a client, Mrs. Alvarez, a widowed schoolteacher, often asked me to alter her skirts. One afternoon, while she sipped tea in my kitchen, she mentioned that her nephew worked as a courier between Houston and Dallas. My heart leapt. That night, after Daniel had gone to bed, I carefully stitched the sealed envelope into the lining of a dress I was altering for her. The next morning, I told her, "Would you mind having your nephew deliver this package to a Mr. A. Ellis in Dallas? It is very important, but I cannot risk the post." She looked at me with curiosity, but asked no questions. Some women understand without words. With that step taken, I felt the first flicker of control returning to me. Yet fear still pressed on my chest. Daniel grew more restless by the day. He came home late, his shirts smelling faintly of perfume that was not mine. He watched the children with an intensity that unsettled me, as if memorizing their faces before leaving. One evening, while pouring himself a drink, he said, "After next month, everything will change." The way he looked at me made my blood run cold. I knew I could not rely only on the law. I needed a backup, a place to run if things collapsed. That was when I thought of Linda, my childhood friend, who had moved to Austin years before to open a bakery. I wrote her a careful letter, telling her only that my marriage was failing and I might need refuge soon. Her reply came swiftly. "You and the children will always have a place here. There is a small room above the bakery. Come whenever you need." That knowledge steadied me. I began hiding essentials, clothes for the children wrapped in brown paper, copies of birth certificates, a few family photographs. I slid them into an old suitcase and tucked it beneath rolls of fabric in my sewing corner. Every step felt like threading a needle in the dark, but I could not falter. If Daniel and Charles sensed my awareness, the note's threat might become real. Yet, if I played my part carefully, smiling at dinner, folding his shirts, nodding at his lies, then perhaps I could buy enough time for the law to act. And still, late at night, a question haunted me. What if Ellis never received my package? What if Daniel moved faster than I imagined? One mistake, one careless step, and the future of my children and my very life would be erased. The morning of September 14th, 1972, dawned with skies as clear as glass. To anyone else, it was just another Thursday. To me, it was the day everything would either collapse or be saved. I rose before the children, prepared eggs and toast, and tried to still the trembling in my hands. Daniel appeared in the kitchen dressed in his navy suit, polished shoes shining like mirrors. He checked his watch 3 times before finishing his coffee. Then, in an unusual gesture, he bent to kiss both James and Clara on the forehead. His voice cracked slightly as he said, "Be good for your mother today." It was the kind of farewell a man gives when he does not intend to return. I forced a smile, waved him off, and then stood frozen in the doorway long after his car disappeared down the street. My heart thundered so loud I could hear it in my ears. Had Ellis received my letter? Would the authorities move in time? By mid-morning? The signs began. Mrs. Alvarez, nephew, the courier, left a discreet note on my porch under the guise of delivering fabric. Your package was received. My knees almost gave out with relief. But even with that assurance, fear gnawed at me. That afternoon, while hemming a dress, I heard a whisper of news from Mrs. Placed. Grayson, the secretary at Daniel's firm. She had stopped by my house, pretending to check on a hemline. With pale lips, she murmured, "Federal men are in the office. They came with briefcases and badges. Mr. Carter tried to leave, but they told him to stay put. Charles is in a room with them now, white as a sheet. I pretended to keep measuring fabric, but my hands were slick with sweat. The trap had been sprung. Still, I dared not let relief show. Until I saw Daniel with my own eyes. Anything could happen. The hours dragged on. I collected the children from school, kept them close, and told them we might stay with Aunt Linda in Austin soon. James, wise beyond his years, studied my face and asked, "Mom, is something wrong with Dad?" I kissed his hair and whispered, "Some choices have consequences, sweetheart, but you and Clara will be safe." It was near dusk when the sirens pierced the still Houston streets. Red and blue lights flickered past our house, racing toward the courthouse district. My heart clenched. I knew where they were headed. An hour later, my sister-in-law burst through the door, breathless. "Evelyn, they arrested Daniel. Him and Charles both. They tried to transfer $1 million into an offshore account, but the feds were waiting. The whole city is talking." I pressed a hand to my mouth, half in shock, half in fierce gratitude. The note that was meant to be my death sentence had become the very proof of his undoing. That night, while the children slept peacefully in their beds, I sat by the window and whispered to the dark sky, "We are free now. Whatever comes next, we are free." The news of Daniel's arrest spread through Houston like wildfire. By the next morning, the story was on every front page. Respected attorney accused of embezzling over $1 million. His partner charged alongside him. And me, Evelyn Carter, labeled the stunned, betrayed wife. When I walked down our quiet street to fetch milk, blinds twitched. Whispers followed. Some eyes held pity. Others, suspicion. How could she not have known? Did she play a part in it? Was she just blind? Or complicit? Those were the questions hanging in the air, like smoke. That morning, I made a choice. I would not hide. I put on my best navy dress, tied my hair neatly, painted a careful line of lipstick, and carried myself to the market. Silence fell when I entered. For a moment, I felt as though my knees would buckle. Then Mrs. Places, Alvarez, bless her heart, said, "Mrs. Carter, it's good to see you standing strong. Do you need any help with the children?" That kindness shattered the ice. I smiled, thanked her, and bought my milk with my head high. Inside, I was trembling, but that small victory gave me strength. 2 days later, a federal marshal came to our door. "Mrs. Cumberland, Carter, well, need your statement in Dallas," he said gently. My heart dropped. I had dreaded this. What if Daniel suspected it had been me who sent the evidence? I left James and Clara with my friend Miriam and boarded the early bus to Dallas. My palms sweated the entire trip. At the courthouse, I sat before 3 stern men, Investigator Ellis, a prosecutor, and a clerk. They assured me I was not accused of anything, but they needed to know what I had seen. For nearly 4 hours, I told my story. How I stumbled on the note. How Daniel's absences lined up with Thursday trips. How I found receipts and property deeds in other names. I omitted one detail that I had sent Ellis the package. Instead, I let them believe I was simply a frightened wife who pieced together fragments. Ellis' eyes told me he knew the truth, but he said nothing. Only when the others left did he hand me his card and whisper, "You saved lives. Mrs. Carter, do not forget your courage." When I returned home that evening, exhausted and hollow, reality pressed in. The bank repossessed our house within 30 days. Friends disappeared, afraid of the scandal. Some neighbors crossed the street rather than speak to me. but a few remained women who brought casseroles. Clients who insisted I keep sewing for them. And, of course, Linda, who wrote again, "Come to Austin. The children will be safe here. And you'll have work in my bakery until you're on your feet." On moving day, I packed our few belongings into suitcases, sold what I could, and took one last look at the house where I had tried so hard to build a perfect life. I felt no grief, only relief. Those walls had held too many lies. That night, as the bus rolled toward Austin, James leaned against my shoulder and Clara slept in my lap. I looked out at the highway lights stretching into the dark and whispered, "This is not the end. It is the beginning." Starting over in Austin was harder than I imagined. Linda welcomed us into the small room above her bakery, the air always scented with sugar and yeast. I worked mornings in the shop, kneading dough until my arms ached, and nights sewing for anyone who needed hems fixed or dresses altered. It was a humble life, but it was honest, and each day I felt the chains of my old world breaking. Months passed. Then, one rainy afternoon in 1975, the past returned in a way I could never have expected. I had just finished fitting a bride's gown when a knock sounded at my apartment door. When I opened it, Lorraine stood there, the teacher from Dallas, her eyes hollow, a baby in her arms. For a moment, I froze. The face of betrayal. The woman who had carried Daniel's child. I wanted to slam the door. But then I looked at the baby round cheeks, dark lashes, a boy with the same chin as James when he was little. Innocent. Blameless. Lorraine's voice trembled. "He left us. Daniel wrote me from prison, saying he couldn't provide. I've been turned away from schools, from my family. I have nowhere to go. I am not asking for charity, just work. Please." Something inside me shifted. This woman had been deceived too, just like me. She was younger, naive, and now cast aside with a child. I couldn't condemn her to the streets. "Come in," I said quietly. "You can help with the bookkeeping for my sewing. Well, make room." That decision changed everything. Lorraine proved steady and meticulous, keeping my accounts balanced and my orders organized. With her support, I could focus on design. Soon, our little venture blossomed into a boutique Carter & Co. atelier where brides and socialites from across Texas came for custom gowns. People whispered about the strange partnership between the betrayed wife and the mistress, but we ignored them. Together, we built something neither of us could have done alone. Years rolled on. James thrived in school and later earned a scholarship in engineering. Clara, with her gift for drawing, joined me in design. Lorraine's boy, whom she named Samuel, grew up alongside my children, calling me Aunt Evelyn. Our unconventional family confused the outside world, but within our walls there was laughter, discipline, and love. In 1982, Daniel was released. Older, thinner, stripped of his arrogance. He came to my boutique one afternoon, asking to see the children. James refused. Clara agreed, seeking her own closure. Lorraine allowed him limited visits with Samuel. As for me, I kept my distance. I no longer carried anger, only clarity. He had chosen his path. I had chosen mine. The years since have been full. The boutique grew into a respected brand. My children carved their own futures, and I found peace in knowing I had turned ashes into strength. Now, at 77, when I sit surrounded by my grandchildren, I sometimes think back to that Bible, to the note that should have sealed my fate. Instead, it became the spark that ignited my freedom. And this, my dears, is the lesson I want to leave with you. What feels like the end can be the very beginning. A betrayal can shatter you, yes, but it can also carve out space for something stronger to rise. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the choice to move forward despite it. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button, subscribe to Grandma's Diary, and tell me in the comments what storm you have faced and where you are watching from. Remember, sometimes the darkest note in our lives leads to the most unexpected music.